Non-conference play is 90% done, so I thought this was the perfect time to do another top 10 teams video. Unlike the AP poll, I'm not able to update the rankings every week. So with that in mind, I'm basing the rankings off of what we saw so far, but also how they will be long term. This is probably the hardest list I ever had to make, because there's a clear top 3, but the top 4 to 15 teams are almost completely interchangeable. I think the gap between them is small. I'll briefly go over honorable mentions. I remember saying right when Stanford blew out Indiana, I want to see more before crowning them super fast. They look good, but they haven't looked anywhere close to what they looked like in the first game. And the team completely tanks if Cameron gets in foul trouble. It almost cost them the game against Duke, but people ignored this because they won. But they then get mauled by Gonzaga. Yeah, Cameron Brink exited the game early, but even when she was in, they were struggling. I think there's at least 3 Pac-12 teams ahead of them. I definitely would have had Utah on here if Neepkins wasn't out for the season. I understand they gave South Carolina a lot of trouble, but so did North Carolina. I don't think that's an automatic qualifier. Peely will be able to carry for a while, but I think the Pac-12 being so deep will wear her down, which means Utah will be taking some losses in conference play. This is by far the most controversial pick for honorable mention. In the first video I made, there were people saying Iowa isn't a top 10 team. As the season goes on, I'm starting to agree with that. Come back a month from now and clown me if I end up being wrong, but I believe on January 21st, when Iowa plays Ohio State, they will get exposed. I believe Caitlin Clark is the best player in college basketball and will probably win National Player of the Year again, but losing their second and third best player in Monica Sonato and Warnock will hurt when they play tougher teams. One person can't do it by themselves. It's weird to me that Iowa is considered a consensus top 5 team, but if you ask most people if Kansas State is a top 10 team, they would say no. If someone wants to say Iowa is a top 10 team, I don't have a problem with that. But Kansas State has to be top 10 too, because they beat Iowa by 7, and in a rematch, they lost to Iowa by 7, and they haven't lost outside of the Iowa game. I don't view Kansas State as a top 10 team, which is why I don't have Iowa either. I went back and forth between Iowa and Uconn for the last spot. I went with Uconn because the gap between Uconn's supporting cast and Iowa's is bigger than the gap between Caitlin Clark and Paige Beckers. Uconn has 3 losses, but who did they lose to? 3 teams that are in the top 10, including UCLA, who looks near untouchable. We have seen when Aaliyah Edwards and Paige Beckers are both having good games, they dominate. Uconn's freshman class has also shown they can contribute year 1 and will continue to get better as the season goes on. The biggest issue with Uconn is the disparity between when they play at home compared to away games. At home, they look like a top 5 team, but when they play outside of Connecticut, they have not looked very good. The 3 losses isn't a big deal. It's more so the fact they look completely outmatched. Even in the Minnesota game, Uconn looked bad. The final score for that game is very misleading. I have faith in Uconn, and I hope they don't burn me again. I'm probably the only person who thinks this, but I think Ohio State is still a top 10 team, and they are very underrated right now. Yeah, they have 2 losses, but who did they lose to? UCLA is a unanimous top 2 team at this point, and USC, who is at worst a top 10 team. And these were single-digit losses where Cody McMahon was completely terrible. If she gives them anything, the result is potentially different. Ohio State has 10 wins so far, all of them being by double digits, 9 of them being at least 20 points. I know Iowa fans won't be happy about this, but I'll ask one question. Is losing to UCLA at home worse than losing to Kansas State at home? If LSU can get boat raced by Colorado and be considered a top 10 team, which I think they are, then Ohio State still being in the top 10, even though they lost to USC, and UCLA isn't crazy to me. But I'm not going to lie and act like the team is perfect. Ohio State is very undersized. J.C. Sheldon, Cody McMahon, and Celeste Taylor are supposed to offset that. But Cody McMahon hasn't made any improvement since her freshman season, and Celeste Taylor is averaging career lows. They have to step up or they will keep losing to the top teams. You're not winning a championship that way. You have three Big 12 teams that are extremely good right now: Texas, Baylor, and Kansas State. They all have similar resumes, which makes it very hard to definitively say which one is better than the other. I picked Texas because I think Rory Harmon is better than any player on either Kansas State or Baylor. They also have a really good freshman in Madison Booker, along with a ton of other good players, one of them being Taylor Jones, who is putting up a ridiculous 70% from the field. Their best win so far was against Uconn. They beat them convincingly in their home gym. Texas is a fast basketball team. They got size, and there are a serious problem defensively. But offensively, they are very streaky, specifically from the three-point line. You'll hear me say this a lot in this video, but a huge issue I have with Texas is their fourth quarter play. They completely took their foot off the gas versus Uconn and Arizona. They ended up winning the game, but these types of bad habits are ones that come back to hurt you later. Kansas State and Baylor are definitely good enough to punish this, and teams in the tournament will be able to punish it too. If Texas loses to Baylor on the 30th, just swap this placement with them, but I think Texas will pull it out. Colorado is another team that's hard to rank because they beat LSU by double digits, but got absolutely blasted by NC State. Is it because LSU isn't that great, or is NC State just that good? Or is it possible that Colorado played uncharacteristically well their first game? No one really knows. But one thing we do know is that Colorado is a team full of upperclassmen with veteran experience. They may not have the roster that other teams have, but they are a team with incredible ball movement and a team that locks people down defensively. They have 4 players averaging in double figures, despite being a defense-first type team. It also helps that it's very hard to win in Boulder, particularly because of the ridiculous altitude. But I think Colorado's greatest strength is also their biggest weakness. They are already an established team that's been playing together for years, so the improvements they will make later in the season will be less significant compared to teams that just added key players in the offseason. Why is USC so good this year? Because Juju Watkins and Rhea Marshall is one of the best 1-2 punches in the entire country. Juju is a rare type of player where when she's on your team, it doesn't matter who is playing on the other team. You have a shot of winning that game. Then you pair her up with Rhea Marshall, who is quietly one of the best defenders in college basketball. This 1-2 punch has been dominant in pretty much every game they have played. The rest of the players aren't household names, but they do what they need to do. They have multiple three-point shooters, but most importantly, this team prides itself on defense. I think Notre Dame will be a top 5 team, and it's not as crazy as it sounds. South Carolina and Notre Dame are the only 2 teams that are top 10 in offensive rating, top 10 in field goal percentage, and top 5 in defensive rating. It's not a coincidence that South Carolina is the only team that has beat Notre Dame so far. Notre Dame is number 5 in net ranking, number 7 in her hoop stats rating, number 9 in Massey ratings. They are the only team who is top 10 in all these metrics, who is not top 10 in the AP poll. And keep in mind, this is a team dealing with several injuries. It's anybody's guess if Olivia comes back, so I'm not factoring that in this ranking. There's also other players I'm unsure of the status of, but Sonia Citron, who is an all-ACC player, will be back soon. Prosper, who typically guards the other team's best player, is coming back too. Notre Dame got mauled by the Gamecocks, but there's not a team that can emulate what they can do outside of UCLA. I call Notre Dame the F around and find out team. I think this team will be underrated until several ACC games are played. No one is messing with the backcourt of Hidalgo and Citron in that conference. Not only can they score the basketball on an efficient level, they put just as much effort on the defensive end. The preseason concerns for Notre Dame this season were three-point shooting and post depth. Notre Dame is top 50 in three-point shooting this year, and Maddie Westbeld and Marshall are averaging career highs. I'll say the same about Notre Dame that I said about USC in the last top 10 I made. Notre Dame being this high will make more sense later in the season. I think LSU is the New York Liberty. I remember when so many people were freaking out that the Liberty didn't look as good as expected at the beginning of the season. But once they got more time to work together, they were able to turn it around. LSU simply has too much talent, and Kim Mulkey is too good of a coach. If this was Kelly Harper or Kelly Graves coaching, then LSU probably wouldn't be a top 10 team. Talent means nothing with a coach doesn't know what to do with it. I'm still not convinced this team is better than last year's, but they have surprisingly become underrated. It's true, LSU has played an extremely soft schedule. Beating teams like Wackneys by 1,000,000 points doesn't show anything. But they also played Virginia Tech, who is a good basketball team. It was Hulk versus Thanos. They had VT thinking they were doing something for a minute, but then they laid the smackdown on them. It's getting downplayed because LSU played at home, but destroying a team like Virginia Tech like that is hard to do on any court. LSU's offense is very similar to Ohio State's. They don't have a real point guard, so what they do is rely on their key players to score in one-on-one situations. But a huge difference is that LSU's best 3 players are better than Ohio State's best 3. The biggest issue LSU will have is their short rotation, mainly due to injury and unexpected departures. The starters have to avoid foul trouble at all costs, or they are going to be in a bind. This video was probably filled with unexpected placements, but the top 3 itself isn't surprising. Not only are these 3 teams undefeated, they have beaten multiple ranked teams in the process. There's something called the Massey ratings. They had NC State being a top 5 team at the beginning of the season. I don't know how they knew, and they deserve a lot of praise because they were the only people who would have thought this. One thing that makes NC State so dangerous is that no one really knows what they can do. This isn't a team made up of players we've seen play in the same system for years. Zoe Brooks is a freshman and is killing it. Sanaya Rivers and Isaiah James have both made tremendous leaps in their play this year. They have weapons in every position and are an amazing defensive team. It's important to mention that NC State is another team that slacks off the fourth quarter. It's something that will get ignored until it inevitably hurts them. NC State is an interesting case. They don't have a definitive superstar player. They have really good players, but they don't have a top 10 player that can just will them to victory, no matter the odds. It's very rare for a team without a top 10 caliber player to win a championship, but it has been done before. I'm very curious to see how their season plays out because we don't see teams like NC State be dominant every day. I said 3 things had to happen for UCLA to become a top-tier team. A. Kiki Rice had to become a better shooter and passer. B. UCLA has to become a better 3-point shooting team. And C. Lauren Betts has to become their best player. I didn't expect them to do all these things this fast. This team is extremely scary. The only difference between the Gamecocks and UCLA is one has a better coach. To put in perspective of how good this team is, they made the Sweet 16 last year with Charisma Osborne being their best player. She's now their 3rd best player. I can't believe Lauren Betts was rotting on Stanford's bench. This has to be one of the craziest fumbles of all time. Not only is Lauren dominating, as most number 1 recruits do, she plays for the rival school. I imagine other Pac-12 teams aren't happy with Stanford because now UCLA is going to be a powerhouse for the next 3 years. I might have to make a separate video talking about how great UCLA is because there isn't enough time in the day. I didn't even get into how they have crazy bench depth, multiple double-figure scorers, and are destroying teams on the boards. There's only one weakness I see in this team. UCLA might be one of the worst fourth-quarter teams I've ever seen, at least in the context of title contenders. This team got boat raced by Arkansas in the fourth quarter, but they had such a huge lead, it didn't matter. Uconn went on a huge run against them too. Ohio State almost dissolved a 22-point lead in only 7 minutes. A big part of that is Ohio State being a really good team, but UCLA is at fault too. This flaw has been overlooked because they are winning, but they can't afford to be bad in the fourth quarter against USC next week. South Carolina lost a lot of players, but as long as they got Dawn Staley, they will always be towards the top. South Carolina has played the hardest schedule outside of Uconn, and they are undefeated. South Carolina is so dominant that they are getting criticized for only beating North Carolina by 7, only beating Duke by 16, only beating Utah by 9. These were all in hostile road environments. And yes, I'm calling Utah a true road game because Uconn fans packed the house to root against South Carolina. There's no other team in the country where you get shocked if they don't blow out other ranked teams. because that's not supposed to happen. South Carolina is too fast. They have too much size, and they have too much skill. No one can shoot like Pow Pow. No one has a defensive player like Ashlyn Watkins. No one has a Malaysia Fulwiley. Lauren Betts is the only center comparable to Cardoso. It's getting so bad to the point where teams' game plan against South Carolina is to just flop and spam threes. That's their only hope. If it's not flopping and hoping players get in foul trouble, it's trying to bait them into fights. Teams know they can't beat South Carolina at full strength, and when they try, they get blown off the floor. I think the only way South Carolina can lose is the same way they lost last year. People are going to have to get in foul trouble, and someone on the other team has to score 40 points. It could happen because it's happened before, but it's not likely. And unlike a lot of teams who drop off in the fourth quarter, South Carolina looks better, and that can be attributed to Dawn Staley. At best, teams tie with South Carolina in the fourth quarter, but they don't get heavily outscored. This is because Dawn Staley has instilled a culture in her team to play hard until the final score. Little details like this will matter later. Not to mention South Carolina is a very young team, so they will keep getting better as the season goes on because they are getting more Division I experience. That's it for this top 10 video. One thing I found interesting was that the CBS current power ranking was similar to what I posted. From the preseason list I did, 7 out of the 10 teams are still there. The order is just different. The biggest change being Uconn. Even if AZ Fudd was healthy, I don't think Uconn would be the best team anymore. I think they could have beat Texas, but I think UCLA still would have won. And obviously, NC State beat them. Either way, I imagine people won't be very happy about Iowa. If they beat Ohio State, I'll concede leaving them out was stupid. But if not, I'm already warning you. I'm going to talk some mess. But that's it for this video. I welcome all opinions one way or the other. Thanks for watching, and happy holidays.